Help yourself and beverages. Probably easier to do that now than halfway through, but feel free.
You'll see some more you recognize later.
Okay.
Photo credit, isn't it?
I'm going to get a photo credit.
Next week? Yeah. Next month. Yeah, Monday.
I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody. It's nice to have a really nice large group here. Welcome to the students that are here from Madison East. Hope you're having a great day so far. This is for those of you that aren't familiar, this is the CPEP seminar, Climate, People, and Environment Program Seminar. And so the idea is to have speakers from across campus and off campus presenting on a variety of topics that fit within those different themes. And so we're very happy today to have Professor Nimish Pujara. Nimish is in Civil and Environmental Engineering. He's a faculty member there, where I also reside. And he has an appointment in Mechanical Engineering as well, and probably other places on campus. He's been doing a lot of really interesting work, and I am not going to say much more than to welcome him and look forward to the presentation. So thanks for being here.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul, and yeah, thank you for the invitation, and thank you everyone for coming. I'll discuss today transport processes driven by water waves. So the research in my lab group involves trying to understand how stuff gets moved around in the environment. Some focus areas include trying to understand how plankton navigates sort of the natural environment, sediment transport, and then also plastics or otherwise marine litter or marine debris. So I just want to start by acknowledging all my advisees and mentees. And this is sort of the summary of what we do. You can see the applications here again. Another one we're started to work on is wave-driven melting of ice. I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. The work I'll present today is mainly done by Claudio, Ju Young, Ben, and then some work by Anna. So why do we care? Well, there are lots of different particles or particulates that float around, particularly in the oceans, but also in the lakes. And I'll go through sort of the motivations for each sort of category that I mentioned earlier. So starting with plankton, there's a whole sort of food web ecosystem that goes on in aquatic environments. And that also determines sort of the fluxes of carbon through the aquatic ecosystem. A lot of that comes in particulate form, small algae, phytoplankton, or various aggregates that form from detritus that kind of feed the carbon pump in the aquatic system. And so in all of these cases, the vertical flux, what happens to the particles in the vertical direction matters. And near the very surface, waves on the surface of the water play an important role, or play a dominant role in determining where these particles go. So this is kind of for plankton. You see it a lot in the news these days. The oceans and lakes are sort of filled with plastic debris or otherwise anthropogenic litter. And there's a lot of interest now to not only clean them up, but to understand what they're doing to the ecosystem and the environment. And so there's lots of research and practical work to predict where these things go. This is sort of a nice sketch from a review paper a few years ago that sort of sketches out the different kinds of processes that happen in an ocean environment for this. And a lot of things that happen at what's called sub-mesoscale scales are often parameterized. So when you compute the dynamics of debris at an ocean or geophysical scale, your grid cells are too large to understand what happens at scales much smaller, and all the sort of wave-driven processes are often parameterized. So what that means is you need to feed the model with some mechanics of how the waves affect these processes. And so you need to study them outside of that modeling frame. The last sort of motivation slide, this is sort of a global study of trying to understand the dynamics of coastal areas around the world, in particular sandy beaches. And this is looking at satellite observations and trying to understand where are sandy beaches being built up or accreted, or where they're being eroded. And you can see, all the red is erosion, and there are places where you lose, 20 meters a year of beach. Right? So it's a big, big problem. The reason it's a problem is that these sandy coastlines are very good at dissipating the energy of the waves and storms coming in. So they provide a natural barrier to flooding at coastlines. If you have a beach that's being eroded, you can try and replenish that sand, and that's done a lot, but it's very expensive, and has its own sort of ecological issues associated with it. And despite this being sort of age-old problem of humanity, coastline protection has been around as long as we have, right? It's still difficult to predict how sand moves around near coastlines, right? So we're still trying to figure out the mechanics of how some of that works. And some of the work in my lab group is based on this. Okay, so with that sort of broad motivation in mind, what I'll try and do is give you some snippets of the different kind of projects that have been going on in my lab group. We also have a group of math modeling students from Madison East High School, as Paul mentioned here. So I wanted to cover some basics of how stuff gets moved around in waves to start. So I'll do that, and I'll show you some kind of very basic stuff that some of you may know very well. And that's sort of my excuse then to, I'll cover some very basic mechanics that have been known for a while. And that's sort of my excuse to talk about a little bit of work based on particle settling and orientation that are the modern analogs of those classical mechanisms. Right? So it's kind of the stuff I'll cover in detail. So one is, if you have a wavy flow and you have particles and they're sinking, how does that work? A lot of particles that you saw in those earlier images and photographs, none of them are spheres, right? So if you have non-spherical particles, what's the kind of simplest predictions you can make about how they orient? And both of these things are modern analogs to some of these classical solutions. So that's what I'll try and describe in detail. And then I'll just give a few snippets of current work that's going on in the lab group. So hopefully that addresses the balance of sort of expertise in the room, as well as things that are interesting, and we can follow up on anything afterwards in more detail. Okay, so if that sounds good, let's start with some basics of transport. By the way, transport, I just mean things moving, right? So it's not like buses and trains, but stuff moving around in a wavy flow field. Okay, so this is what the flow in waves looks like. These are waves, water waves, traveling left to right, and hopefully you can see the arrows here, and they show how fast the water is moving at any given point in space and time. Maybe it's worth staring at this for a little bit. But perhaps a few things that are interesting to note is that the water motion, characterized by these arrows, is just oscillating. And it's oscillating both horizontally and vertically. And then the waves travel left to right. So immediately what that tells you is that the water is not really going anywhere. Things are just moving around back and forth, oscillating both horizontally and vertically. And so, let's maybe make those points. By the way, we know kind of how the water moves around in waves. This has been known for some time, and I'm just writing down the equations here in case you're interested. But the observations are that the wave is traveling a lot faster than the water. The flow is just oscillating in both directions, out of phase. So when the velocity is maximum in the horizontal direction, it's 0 in the vertical. And when it's fully going upwards, it's not moving horizontally. Right? So the two directions are out of phase. And if I sit here and measure the flow, and I make a plot of velocity versus time, I just see oscillations. And so on average, it's not going anywhere. And so the mean flow, in the Eulerian sense, is 0. So that means there is no transport in waves. It just moves back and forth. Until you say, okay, let me track the motion of some small parcel of water or particle of water that started at this point. And so these, they're starting at different positions. And then all we're saying is that at any given point, this parcel moves with the velocity at that point. Okay. So this is how that small parcel of water, or indeed a particle within a wave, would actually move. So what's going on here? Let's make a few observations. So if you follow these water particles, then there's a net drift in the direction of wave propagation. That drift is small, right? The waves are moving past way faster than this drift. And it's happening on some kind of wave average sense. You kind of have to go through several wave cycles to see this drift. And then it's also a function of depth, right? Very quickly, there's not much drift at all if you go deeper into the waves. So this phenomena is known as Stokes drift. It's been known for a long time, right? So this is a citation from 1847. It's almost the same age as this university, 175 years. So this is a very well-known result. And for the experts in the room, you can think about this as the difference between the Lagrangian and Eulerian means. Right? That's what the Stokes drift is. But effectively what this means is if I follow a particle, I end up with a net drift. To think about why this works, think about the fact that the speed is higher at the speed decays with depth. So when I'm at the top, I travel faster than when I'm at the bottom. Right? And I also travel for longer, by the way, because I'm kind of following this wave. So I travel for faster and longer at the top of these oscillations than at the bottom. And that means that over a full cycle, if I follow that particle, there's a drift. Whereas if I sit in one location, there's no mean. The average is 0. So that's the basic mechanism and has been known about for a long, long time. The main two things I'll discuss in detail today are modern analogs of this phenomenon. So I want to show you how we do, so now that we know this effect occurs and I can compute it, how can I predict it? What is the equation that tells me how fast this drift is? How can we isolate and predict this drift? So this is how you would set it up, right? So this is for the Math Modeling Club. You would say that the position of your particle, its rate of change is just given by the flow speed at that point in space and time. Okay. And then all I have to do to predict the drift is solve this equation. But the problem is the position is on the left-hand side of the equation and on the right-hand side of the equation. Position of this particle. And it changes with time. Right? So it's on both sides of the equation, so there's no easy way I can see to solve this. So how can we find a solution? Well, we go back to the observations we made of this phenomenon, which is to say that the particle drifts slowly relative to the wave motion, and it happens on some wave average sense. Whereas the oscillation of the particles, moving back and forth, or up and down, occur quite quickly on the average of waves. Right? On the time scale of waves. So mathematically I can treat this as saying, okay, really the particle motion in time, I'm going to formally separate it into two different time axes. I'm going to say there's a fast time that cycles through the waves and just oscillates. And then there's this slow time vector, capital T, which is the time over which I can predict the drift. So this is the mathematical way I'm going to deal with it. So I split time into two different time vectors. And then I put that into the same equation I had here, so now the rate of change of position of the particle is a function of the fast time and the slow time. And then the drift is going to come from this slow time dynamics. Right? And so putting it in and working through the algebra and turning the crank, I can predict what the drift is in equation in prose form. Makes sense? There's no drift in the vertical direction. You saw that in the animation, right? There's no drift. They're not drifting either up or down in a wave average sense. And then the drift in the horizontal direction is a function of the depth and wave height and wavelength and all those kinds of wave parameters. Okay, so this is our analytical tool to understand this kind of phenomenon. Right? So to summarize, on average, stuff doesn't move anywhere in waves. Unless you're careful and you follow parcels of water or particles, and then you see that there is this slow drift known as Stokes drift, and you can compute it by a separation of time into fast time and slow time. Right? Okay. This is, 150 years ago, this would have been a good lecture, right? Okay, I want to show you another mechanism by which things can move in waves. So now we're close to the seabed. So that's the seabed. This surface is way up high, right? So this is way up high. I'm just drawing it here so you can visualize it. And near the seabed, the flow can't go through the bed, so it just oscillates back and forth in horizontal. And it follows the phase of the wave itself. So it's purely horizontal, and the velocity variations are in phase with the wave. But again, if I sit at any given point and compute an average, it's 0. Here, there's no Stokes drift either because there's no vertical velocity to break the symmetry between up and down. But what actually happens is that the flow sticks to the bed, to the seabed. Every fluid has some stickiness called viscosity, and it sticks to the bed. And so there's variations in the flow with vertical distance above the seabed. And because there's variations, that also induces some vertical velocity. And this is what the reality looks like. So there's some small vertical velocity and most of the velocity is horizontal. And what this means now, this is sort of technical, but if I average the product of the two velocities over a wave, they're not perfectly out of phase with each other like they were in the near surface, right? Where the horizontal velocity is 0 and the vertical is max, and vice versa. That's no longer true here. And this effectively means that there's a stress in a wave average sense and drives a mean current. So there is an Eulerian mean here. It's not a Stokes drift. It's an Eulerian mean. There's a net drift in this boundary. And that's all caused by the fact that this boundary means that the water sticks to it. So again, later I'll show you sort of an extension of this that's going to be useful for some of the work. Okay, this is again the result that's normally attributed to Stokes. I couldn't find the original citation. It's from around 1850. Okay, so with that background in mind, we can move on to the main sort of thing I want to try and cover. And let's start with the settling part. So how does two particles settle in waves? Okay, so we did some laboratory experiments. These were done by PhD student Ju Young Bang. And we have a tank, and we sort of disturb the water by moving this cylinder up and down, and it generates waves, and we absorb them at the edge of the tank. And then in the middle, we have a sort of a quantitative imaging system, a LED panel, and a camera looking in from the side. And we put lots of seeding particles in the water that are small, so they sort of follow the flow of the water. And then we drop a sphere that sinks through this water column. Okay? And we can track all that. And Ju Young did a ton of experiments with 5 different types of particles. You can kind of see their parameters. They tend to be on the order of millimeters big, so this is the kind of size range we care about with the plankton and the microplastics and things like that. So between 2 and 6 millimeters. And if there are no waves, they settle at these sort of speeds. They sink at about 7 to 15 or 18 centimeters per second, right? That's roughly what they settle at. Okay, and this is the data now. So okay, this is, my animations at the start were easy to make. This is actual data. Right? So these are fluid velocity vectors measured with particle image velocimetry, and then this sphere that's tracked through this flow field. And here are the parameters. So gamma, by the way, is its specific gravity. So it's about 12% denser than the water, this nylon. So let's stare at this a little bit and see what we observe. I'm going to wait till the start. So the flow is just moving back and forth, but the particle is settling through it, so it goes down. But during the up cycle of the flow, it doesn't come up too much. But it goes down, and when it goes down, it obviously goes down for longer and faster because it's moving with downward flow. Whereas when it's coming back up, it's moving through the flow, so the relative velocity is higher, so it goes for shorter, and it's going slower because it's fighting against the flow. Right? So this is the same thing as Stokes drift, but in the vertical direction. There's a bias in how the particle samples the flow. It samples the downside more than the upside. And so this means that we should expect a vertical Stokes-like drift for this particle settling through this wavy flow field. And what this means in terms of the consequences is that this particle should fall faster in waves than it does without waves. So it's falling faster than its terminal settling velocity because there's this added drift. For me, that's still quite a cool concept. It doesn't mean it falls faster than its terminal settling velocity. Okay, so how are we going to predict this? So I already introduced you to this stuff, right? So we say that the particle position, we know what it is, but really it's following a fast time dynamics and a slow time dynamics. And here, now we're saying that so this is just how quickly the particle's moving in the horizontal direction, how quickly it's moving in the vertical direction. In the horizontal direction, the data shows that mainly it follows the flow. But in the vertical direction, it follows the flow and then slips relative to the flow at its terminal settling velocity. Okay? So it follows the flow, but is also settling at the same time. So this is its settling velocity, and it slips relative to the flow. We put that through the machine, crank the handle, and produce the drift predictions. And this is what the trajectory looks like, right? And it goes down faster, comes up less, down faster, comes up less. So the first prediction you make is that the settling velocity is indeed enhanced. And it's some, what determines how much of this effect takes place is how quickly it slips relative to the flow, right? How quickly its terminal settling velocity is. So it makes sense that it's a function of Vs. And then it makes sense that the whole thing is a Stokes drift-like effect. So this is, the Vs just produces a coefficient in front of the Stokes drift, classical Stokes drift, and that's what predicts the velocity enhancement. Right? So it's falling faster, on average, over many waves, it's falling faster than it would without the waves. The horizontal drift is also reduced, because for every cycle, it slowly is moving further and further lower into the water column where the effect weakens and weakens. Right? The Stokes drift decreases as I move down into the water column. And so there's also a reduction in the horizontal drift relative to something that doesn't sink. Okay, and some other references here too that have discovered similar things. So we can go into the data and see whether we see this effect. So here's the function that predicts how much settling is enhanced by. This is basically how fast the particle falls in still fluid. And then we're calculating what is the average flow velocity that the particle samples. Right, so the hypothesis is that it should see more of the downward flow than the upward flow. And that's what leads to the effect. And indeed we see that, and then the effect is on the order of 1%, which is roughly what Stokes drift is relative to the wave speed, basically. So you see it in the data. It's not perfect, but it's the same kind of effect. The data also shows that there are more complex things going on. So I said earlier that, basically in the horizontal direction it follows the flow, and in the vertical direction it follows the flow and then slips relative to that. And for the smaller particles, or the ones that don't settle too quickly, we see that, right? So you put them in the tank. Initially, they don't match the local flow, but over some time, they start to follow the flow in the horizontal direction. So the difference between these two becomes 0, and then this just becomes the difference between the particle and fluid velocity in the vertical direction just becomes the terminal settling velocity, and that's fine. Right? That's what we said. But if the particles start to fall a little bit faster, then so the flow that the particle sees is coming up through it, and there's a weight behind the particle. But for particles that fall a little bit faster, that weight becomes unstable and starts wobbling around. And so beyond a certain speed, or Reynolds number, this no longer follows the flow in the horizontal direction. You see oscillations. And so these oscillations are caused by the fact that this relative flow coming at it has so much inertia that it can't hug the back of the particle and starts wobbling around. And that wobbling of the flow wobbles the particle. And so this is going to disrupt our mechanism. Right? It's going to disrupt our Stokes drift-like mechanism. And that's one of the things we see in the data. So I don't show it here. But what's cool is that these wobbles don't seem to be affected by the waves. And we think that that's because there's a big separation of scales between the particle and the wave. Right? So there's not much interaction between those two scales. Which also means that if there were scales in fluid motion that were closer, like for turbulent flow, you would see that, and that's something we're also working on. Okay, so this is sort of the end of the first part. For particles settling in waves, what we see is that there's a vertical analog of the horizontal Stokes drift, which means that there's an enhancement of the terminal settling velocity. It falls faster than it would otherwise. And there's been a lot of work trying to understand how the inertia of the particle changes these dynamics, but what the lab results are really showing is that it's the fluid inertia that matters more, and cause they can cause path instabilities within the system, so that this thing doesn't follow the flow in the horizontal direction. Okay, that's the first part. I'm going to move on to the orientation of particles. So this is for looking at some non-spherical shape, and you'll see we'll look at the simplest possible case. To show that, I kind of have to introduce you to how particles rotate within a flow. And these are in the inertialess limit, meaning that these are small particles. Right? So we're thinking of little bits of little specks that are in the water, or some kind of particulate organic matter, all kinds of things. Plankton, diatom chains, whatever. Lots of little particles. None of them are spherical, but they're all small and they're floating around. And if you imagine a flow into this page being sheared, so this side is coming this way, that side is going that way, so there's this shear in the flow, and you have a particle that's kind of this cigar-shaped thing where you pull a sphere and make it elongated. It rotates with a sort of known solution, which is given in equation form here. Right? When it's lined up with the flow, it sort of slows down, and then when it's perpendicular to the flow, it speeds up. And this has been known, and this is the analytical results from 1922 by Jeffrey. But what this means for us is that if I know the shear within the fluid, I can compute how the particle gets reoriented. And we can do this not just for spheres that have been stretched, but also spheres that have been squished, like M&Ms. Right? And how much I pull it or how much I squish it, that's kind of like a shape factor. And that allows me to characterize the shape of the particle. So this is the simplest non-sphere, basically. And this is given by this parameter lambda. If it's positive, I've pulled it. If it's negative, I've squished it. And then, you can compute its orientation in full 3D. That's not too bad. Now, we looked at the velocity. We looked at how the flow varies within waves. But it's not just that the flow varies. The flow is also stretched and squished in an oscillatory way. So there are also gradients in velocity in an oscillatory that are oscillations. So, for example, if I go from a trough to a peak, back to a trough, and I stay at the same vertical level, the magnitude of the stretching and squishing don't change, but their orientation changes. Right? I get squished in a different direction under the crest as I do under the trough. And so, you can see where I'm going with this. There's going to be a cycle of these gradients, and if I sit at any given point, the net average over the cycle is 0, but if I follow parcels of fluid, there's going to be stretching and squishing that has a preferred direction. And so this is the angular analog of the horizontal Stokes drift. Anyway, you can write down what these stretching and squishings are. And then let's say we put this particle in there. So it's a slightly pulled sphere, so it's a spheroid. And I started vertical. Hopefully you can see this. So this angle being 0 suffices this angle. So if it's 0, the football is pointing up and down. Right? And then I let it go in waves. And there's this angular analog of Stokes drift, which means that it wobbles, you can see, right? It's oscillating at a fast time, but over a slow time it's approaching some stable orientation. And that is a function of its shape and how it couples to these stretching and squishings, these velocity gradients. So the net particle rotation has a Stokes drift-like preferred angular orientation. So if I give you a shape, you can predict what is the average orientation at which this particle will behave within a wavy flow field. And it's due to the same kind of effect. So since it's due to the same kind of effect, we're going to run it through the same machinery. I can write down how the change of angle behaves. And then I say, okay, it changes quickly over many waves, over a single wave. So there's a fast time oscillation, and then there's a slow time drift of the angle that reaches some steady value. So again, I run it through the machinery, and these are the equations I predict for the drift. And then you can plot them. So this is for a sphere that's being pulled, and this is for a sphere that's being squished. And so this is the angle in plane, so how that particle would be in this angle, with the waves going this way. And then this angle is out of plane. So does it fall away from the waves or not? And you see, no matter where you start the particle, there's always one angle that it comes back to. There's only one stable orientation. And it's different for whether you stretch it or squish it. So it's on a different branch of the solution. And by the way, this angle is in plane. So pi by 2 in my definition means that the particle stays in the plane of the waves, which maybe makes sense intuitively. But you can find what this angle is for any given shape. Right? So these are just two examples. And this is what the solution looks like. So remember, positive means that I've stretched it. Negative means that I've squished it. And this is how the angle changes as a function of how much you stretch or how much you squish. But in both cases, so these are examples again, in both cases you can see that the long part of the particle is being pulled to the top right. And that kind of makes sense if you go back here and stare at these velocity gradients enough, right? Under the crest, it's being pulled in that direction. And so that's going to happen more than when you're down here and being pulled in the other direction, because you're lower in the water column within that Stokes drift cycle. So this is the angular analog of the Stokes drift, and this is a fairly recent discovery. Okay, so what? Well, one thing is that if you have particles that look like this, the stretched ones, they sink at different speeds depending on their orientation. Right? So this is going to have lower drag than this. And so let's say you ignore everything I've told you and assume that it's some sphere. then this blue line tells you how wrong you'd be. You can be as wrong as 50%, depending upon the shape. And let's say you say, okay, I'll give you the shape, but I won't care about the orientation. I'll assume it's randomly oriented. Then this black line tells you how wrong you could be. You could be wrong by as much as sort of 10, 20%. So this is, one of the consequences of these dynamics. There's work going on by postdocs Sam and Ben that are looking at how light penetrates through a wavy water column. And because these particles, depending upon their orientation, scatter light in different ways, that changes how deep you have to go before it's sort of dark. And that, this is important because all the carbon in water systems generally comes from small algae that fix that carbon, right? And so the light is an important quantity for the aquatic ecosystem. Okay, so this is kind of the end of this little bit, and basically to say that particles have a preferred orientation that only depend on their shape, and it has a number of consequences, including how quickly they settle. Okay, so I guess, yeah. So two sort of modern analogs of classical Stokes-Drift phenomena, right? For vertical and for angular processes. Okay, so that's kind of some of the simple stuff that we've been doing that I thought would be fun to share. And now I'm just going to go through a few sort of research projects that are going on again, wave-driven phenomena that might be interesting, and I'll sort of hopefully go through them fairly quickly. I have 2 or 3. The first is coastal sediment transport, which was one of our original motivations. So now things start to look a little bit more complicated. If you're at a beach and waves come and they break and suspend sediment and will do all kinds of things, we were trying to understand overall how we can improve predictions of this sediment transport. And one thing that's been hypothesized quite a lot in recent years is that as these waves come and slosh against the previous wave and create these sort of interactions between subsequent waves, that seems to impact a lot how much the sediment gets moved around. You can see it in these images. So for example, here's a wave coming in, and this is the flow that's going back from the previous wave, and suddenly there's a big sediment suspension event. So it didn't happen here, but it did happen here. And this is going to totally, this is a lot of sediment for that given event. If you try and model these processes, this is a comparison, between experiments and a good numerical model. You can predict the variations in water depth and velocity reasonably well, but look at the comparison with sediment, right? There are these big peaks in sediment suspension, suspended sediment concentration in the data that the model just doesn't pick up. So this is a clear gap and could be one of the things that's affecting our predictions. So this was a big experimental campaign done by Claudio, a PhD student. And we have a big wave tank where we can send in multiple waves and measure what's going on near the shoreline. The main thing to note is that we're going to measure the water depth near the shore in 2 different ways. One is by measuring the water depth, and the other is by measuring the pressure at the bottom. And this is the kind of data you get. So here are the 2 signals. One is the water depth measurement, and the other is the pressure turned into units of depth, right? So if I'm under lots of water above me and the water's not moving, the pressure's high because of hydrostatic pressure, right? And then that hydrostatic pressure is there to support the weight of the water above me. And so you see that when a wave comes and crashes into the near shore, these 2 signals are basically the same. I should pause and say, so the pressure measurement gives me an effective weight of the water above me. And then the blue line gives me the actual water above me. Okay? So any difference between the 2 relates to how that water is being accelerated up and down. So for example, if you go into the elevator and the moment you start accelerating down, you feel lighter on your feet. While you're accelerating, your feet feel less than your own weight at the bottom. And the same is true coming up. When you start to accelerate up, for a moment while you're accelerating, you feel heavier than you are. There's more pressure on your feet than you're within the weight of your body. So the difference between these two lines tells us about how much acceleration is going up and down. And what you see is that, when one wave arrives, nothing happens. When it interacts with the next wave coming in, there's a big difference between these two. And in particular, this part results in a big vertical acceleration. So in these interactions, there are these big vertical acceleration events that are potentially suspending the sediment. Right? We don't know that because we don't have sediment here, but this is the hypothesis that we wanted to test. And this is almost as large as gravity, right? But in the opposite direction. Okay, so what's nice is that Claudio ran many experiments, and we could map them onto how big the second wave is compared to the first wave, and how far they are in time to kind of understand how this system works. And there are these different kinds of interactions that can happen that show you the symbols. But the color bar tells you the accelerations, and we see accelerations that are frequently above that of gravity. So these are big, they create big vertical acceleration events, and we think they could be one mechanism by which the sediment could get liquefied and pulled up into the water column and correspond to the image I showed you, the photo I showed you from the beach. Okay, so that's one little project. Another is focused on trying to understand debris beaching. So the plastic is everywhere, right? So there's lots of efforts to try and understand where it goes. This is a study from the Dutch coastline with years and years of beach cleanups and lots of data, trying to understand how much plastic there is every given year on the beach across the coast. You know roughly what the winds do along the Dutch coastline. It's very windy, basically, and generally pointing that way. And so you can try and understand how this stuff gets moved around. And then you can do, data-driven modeling, other modeling, and the question is always, let's say you know how much plastic is coming in. Where is it all going? It could be sinking to the bottom, and it could be beached. Right? We want to try and understand that process. Now we already hinted at this at the start, which is to say that this is in longitude and latitude, right? So there's no way you would even see waves here. But the waves are what cause the beaching, right? If you ever watch driftwood on a beach, it's the waves that wash it up and leave it there. And so we need to there's no hope of understanding it from that data, basically. You need to look at it at a smaller scale. So this is work led by PhD student Ben, and some modeling help with an undergraduate, Jamie. So again, we send in a pulse in our wave tank, we put in some debris, and there's, in this case, a few different particles. They get flown up the beach, and some of them stick and some of them come back. And so our goal is to understand why some stick and some don't. And so the Madison East High School students have been doing this modeling exercise all morning, so they're ahead of the curve here. So our simplest model for predicting this was to say, okay, let's, we have, I won't go into the details here, but we have a simplified model of what this flow looks like. It's no longer the wavy sort of oscillatory flow, it's a different kind of flow. And then we can say, okay, if I know what the debris is, I know, F equals ma tells me how it moves, and I can compute its solution and figure out, integrate A to get V and integrate V to get X, right? You get the position. So there was a bit of work we had to do to kind of flesh out exactly how this floating particle would, what kind of forces there would be on there. And that was building on some recent work. But then we realized that, there are two main ingredients you have to add to predict beaching. One is that if you're very near the tip here, that's riding up the beach, then the particle is going to get caught up in that tip. And so you add that through this kind of modeling. And then the last one is that, as the flow comes down and the particle gets deposited on the beach, what leads to beaching is that there's friction with the sand of the beach. And so you have to add that in, and again, this is the kind of simple model we added to predict that. And then Ben and Jamie were able to show that you can predict this whole thing with a two-parameter system. One is that how big or heavy the particle is. That's quantified by its Stokes number, the particle inertia. And you can imagine this, the flow's going up, the particle goes along with it, but if the particle keeps carrying on because it has a lot of inertia, then the flow comes back and it gets left behind. Right? So that's the particle inertia effect. But that's not enough. You also have to know how fast the particle enters this system. Because if it enters very slowly, it's never going to get to that stage where it gets left behind. Right? So both of these things matter. So its initial velocity and its inertia determine whether it gets beached or not. So as both increase, the color means that it does get beached, and then the shade of the color tells you where it gets beached. Right? So if both of these things are high, you get left at the very top. And if one is small or both are small, you get left near the bottom. And so we put this model and compared it with those particle tracks Ben had. And you're comparing this dashed red line, which is the model, and these blue crosses, which is the particle tracks. And in most cases, it's a pretty good prediction for how simple the model is. Here, it didn't do so well, but it still predicts that the particle is beached. And there are some interesting reasons why this one doesn't work as well. But on the whole, this simple model gives you a good qualitative picture, or a good quantitative picture of how particles get beached. Okay, the last one I'll talk about, this is sort of the least developed. There's some new work with some collaborators, both in this department and in geosciences, is to understand wave erosion of ice cliffs. This is work by PhD student Anja Woltmann. This is a nice figure adapted from an old paper by Anja. If you have an iceberg, there are many different ways by which the iceberg melts in the ocean. One of the more prominent ways is that waves will cut these notches into ice just like they cut notches into cliffs. You can see some field evidence for this. We're not sure, obviously we're not sure, but this was an iceberg shed off the Ross ice shelf and then got frozen into the sea. And the hypothesis here is that that iceberg overturned, and you can see what looks like a notch cut by waves. And the wave cuts this notch and leaves this big foot behind, and that causes it to flip up. This is the hypothesis. So this is in a paper that's in review by Nicola Sartori, who's a student in this department. Okay, so to understand these wave-cut notches, again we did some experiments. Here's the ice block, here's our waves generator. It bangs into the ice and causes some melting, and we were trying to understand that process. And I'll show you what the data looks like. So we're able to image this ice blocks from the side and see these beautiful wave-cut notches. And so this is the one where there's the biggest notch at a given time. And if we lower the wave amplitude, there's less and less of ice erosion. Or if we lower the water temperature, there's less and less ice erosion, which makes sense. The colder water is going to melt the ice less than the warmer water, and smaller waves are going to melt the ice less than bigger waves. And so with these kind of images, we can do some quantitative imaging, measure or find where the ice edge is as a function of time. So as you go from blue to yellow, that's how the notch is being cut in time. And so we're trying to analyze this data more carefully to try and understand that process and predict how much melting occurs as a function of ice and wave properties and things like that. I'll show you just the starting points of some theory for this. So this is our simplest theoretical model. The waves come in and bounce back off the ice, and so what you get are standing waves. Waves propagating in both directions. They're just oscillating, oscillating in this way. And this is the flow field. Right? So already you can see the most action is happening here, which is where you expect the most erosion. And then already you can see that below a certain amount, the water is not really moving, so you're not going to get much erosion below that. Right? And that's consistent with what we see in the data. The other thing we see, so the other thing you can predict by doing some more analysis is the streaming effect I talked about at the start. So remember when the flow near the seabed is back and forth, because it sticks to the surface, that creates a variation in how the flow moves with distance away from the ice, which then induces a velocity in the other direction. Now they're no longer out of phase, and then there's a streaming effect. And so the streaming effect, our first calculation suggests that the streaming is down. Right? So what this means is that any meltwater or any melting that occurs is being advected down without the buoyancy effect, so just by the wave-induced mechanics. And so this would accelerate the melting, right? Because any cold water that builds up in front of here is pushed down, more warm water can come and erode more of the ice. So we're working on this. It's still not, this is as far as we've got. Okay, that's it. Thank you for listening. Just want to thank funding sources. Here's some papers that are already published on some of the work I presented. Really want to thank my collaborators, Michelle, Ryan, Jack, Jean-Luc, Till, and Luke. And then I especially want to thank all the lab members that contributed to the research that I presented here. Ju Young, Khan, Jamie, Ben, Claudia, and Mia. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks Nimish. Really, really nice talk, appreciate it. We definitely have some time for questions, so this is your chance to ask as simple or as complex of a question as you would like. So I'll let you call.
Yeah, Martina. Yeah.
I was just wondering, maybe I missed in the table in the second section, but for the sediment settling, did you look at like buoyancy or changing the density of the particles at all?
Yeah, so these are all plastics, two different types of nylon and Torlon, so they go from about 12% heavier than water to 40% heavier than water. Sediment is like 260% heavier than water, roughly, or something. But I didn't show it here, just to keep things a bit simple, but they combine in a certain way. So whether this happens, whether this wobble happens or not, is predicted by a combination of particle size, its theoretical settling speed, and how viscous the fluid is. So that theoretical settling speed is a combination of size and density again. So you can predict it. You can predict exactly what density does to the problem, and there's a threshold. When that number is above, I don't know, something like 150 or 200, you get wobbles. So you know, you could predict it for other particle classes.
More questions?
Ben.
When you're doing kind of the orientation, you got to get average rate where you use the term maximum squared. Could you explain to us what that term is and what it represents?
Where's the best place to see it? I guess here, right? So I guess epsilon is some small number. Correlates roughly to the wave steepness, which tends to be small. And it's not too hard to show, although it takes a little bit of thinking, that it's always going to be coming about as epsilon squared, because if it's order epsilon, it would matter whether the waves are trough to crest or crest to trough. So the only way it works is if it's order epsilon squared, and so that's the right scaling to predict the drift. Yeah, and it roughly corresponds to the steepness of the wave.
Why does experiments use freshwater or saltwater?
Maybe you can repeat it.
Oh, sure, yeah. So the question is, should we be thinking about freshwater versus saltwater for these experiments?
Yeah.
For some, yes. For others, no. Although the oceanographers will disagree with me. So for this, it doesn't matter. What's that?
So it doesn't always matter. I was just curious in Anya's case in particular.
Yeah. So in that case, it definitely matters.
Yes.
Yeah. So, in this case, it definitely matters whether that's salt or freshwater, because it changes as a function of both salinity and temperature, whether the meltwater is denser or less dense. Yeah. But you know, actually, so of course, I don't disagree with the oceanographers here, but the oceanographers will also tell you that it matters for other things. Like, you know, exactly how this process breaking takes place. There's all these weird micro layers at the surface that depend on the local salt concentration, and breaking can change. So, you know, if you really care about details, then for that, even, you know, salt
No,
can matter
it's a-
even then. Yeah.
It's just a thought.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
This is sort of a more bigger picture sort of question, comments, but
Pursued, quite actively in various subfields. A good example is chain-forming diatoms. So a single diatom cell is an oblate, is like a cylinder, squish cylinder. When they form chains, they suddenly turn into a prolate shape and could have access to more light, changes their settling dynamics. Then it's going to start working on how the flexibility of that chain matters. So yeah.
And maybe a quick follow-up to that is, at what size do things get too small to feel these kinds of effects enough?
That's a good question. No size is too small, but there are other effects that come into play at smaller sizes. So, something like this, which is what this is built on. No size is too small for this, but if you get too small on the order of like single-digit microns, then the thermal diffusion matters too. So then there's a orientation diffusivity, a rotational diffusivity that adds to this phenomenon.
Interesting.
Yeah, so this is all in the viscous limit. So no size is too small, but then the molecular dynamics matter at small size.
We have time maybe for one more question, if anyone has one. Okay, great. Well, let's thank Nimish again then.